The wind that sweeps across the North Atlantic still carries the voice of the past, cold, ancient, and eternal. It murmurs through the fjords of Norway and over the icebound shores of Greenland, whispering stories that were first told beside smoky hearths in timber halls 1,000 years ago. The sagas spoke of voyages beyond the edge of the known world, of ships with dragon-headed prows sailing into seas where no charts existed. These tales would echo through centuries, and one day, a single fragile map would ignite one of history's most intriguing controversies. A question that reaches to the heart of human curiosity. Did the Vikings discover America first? In medieval Iceland, memory was geography. The sagas were maps of the mind, oral histories that preserved directions, coastlines, and landmarks through verse and story. Among these, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red describe journeys westward, away from the glacial grip of Greenland toward lands where the soil was dark and fertile, where salmon filled the rivers and where wild grapes climbed the trees. To the Norse who braved those waters, it was a realm of promise, a place they called Vinland. The men and women who set sail from Greenland around the year 1000 AD were already part of a restless civilization of navigators. From the shores of Scandinavia, Viking ships had reached as far as Byzantium and the Caspian Sea. They had colonized Iceland and discovered Greenland under Eric the Red. But beyond Greenland's western horizon lay something unknown. Not rumor, but whispers of land glimpsed by sailors blown off course, of driftwood from trees that could not have grown in the Arctic cold, of birds flying westward at sunset. Those clues stirred the imagination of Eric's son, Leif Erikson, a man driven by the same bold spirit that had carried generations across the northern seas. Leif gathered a crew and set sail from Brattahlid, the Greenland settlement his father had built. With the late summer sun low on the horizon, they rowed between icebergs and rode the ocean currents westward. For days, fog and wind surrounded them. Then, as the story goes, they saw land, rocky shores and rolling forests. They named it Helluland, the land of flat stones. Sailing further, they reached another coast where sandy beaches met wooded hills, Markland, the forest land, and beyond that still, a gentler region with rivers, meadows, and wild vines. They called it Vinland, the land of wine. Archaeology would one day confirm the truth beneath these legends. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a place now known as L'Anse aux Meadows, excavations in the 1960s uncovered the remains of Norse buildings, turf-walled structures, iron nails and boat rivets identical to those found in Greenland. Radiocarbon dating placed them around the year 1000. Here, at the edge of a cold bay, stood the physical proof that Vikings had reached the Americas nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. Yet their presence was fleeting. The settlement was small, likely seasonal, and soon abandoned. Harsh winters, distance, and conflict with local peoples, whom the sagas called Skraelings, discouraged colonization. The Norse retreated eastward, and their brief chapter in the New World faded into the long night of memory. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The ocean that had once been the Vikings' frontier became, in the age of Columbus and Magellan, a pathway for other explorers. Europe redrew its map, and the legend of Vinland became a footnote, half believed, half forgotten. Then, in the mid-20th century, a single artifact seemed to awaken it again. A parchment map that hinted at the impossible. That someone in medieval Europe might have known about America long before 1492. It appeared quietly, almost mysteriously. In 1957, a manuscript surfaced in the hands of an antiquarian book dealer. Bound with 2 other medieval texts, the Tartar Relation and parts of Vincent of Beauvai's Speculum Historiale, it contained a map unlike any other. On it, the world of the 15th century spread out in faded ink: Europe, Asia, and Africa, drawn in the style of medieval mappa mundi. But there, to the west of Greenland, a small island was labeled Vinlandia Insula. It was a revelation, if genuine, a medieval acknowledgement of North American land centuries before Columbus's voyage. The map's journey into history began when the dealer offered it to the British Museum. The institution, cautious and skeptical, declined to buy it. Soon after, it was acquired by an American collector, Lawrence C. Whitten III, who in turn sold it to Yale University. In 1965, Yale announced its existence to the world in a lavishly printed volume, The Vinland Map and the Tartar Relation. Scholars and the public alike were electrified. Could this fragile parchment truly prove that medieval Europe had known of America's existence long before Columbus set sail? Physically, the map was unassuming, roughly 28 by 40 centimeters, drawn on aged parchment, its ink lines brown and faint. A Latin inscription suggested it was made around 1440. The parchment itself, later radiocarbon dated, indeed belonged to that century. Its binding matched the medieval companion texts it was found with, complete with wormholes aligning between volumes, evidence that seemed to confirm its authenticity. For a time, excitement eclipsed doubt. The map showed Greenland as an island, remarkably shaped for the time, and beyond it, Vinland. Its coastlines bore little resemblance to modern maps, yet the implication was unmistakable. Someone before Columbus had charted lands across the Atlantic. To many, it seemed the perfect synthesis of legend and proof. The Vikings had not only reached America, their discovery had somehow been recorded, copied, and preserved through medieval scholarship. But history is cautious. For every claim, there must be evidence, and beneath the excitement, questions began to stir. The map's provenance, its chain of custody, was obscure. There were no records of it before the 20th century. It was absent from medieval catalogues and inventories, even those listing the texts bound with it. How could such a map, if it existed in the 15th century, have remained utterly unknown through the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, and the centuries of cartographic revolution that followed? As experts examined it more closely, peculiarities emerged. The Latin used on the map included forms inconsistent with 15th century usage. Some spellings and abbreviations reflected later periods. The depiction of Greenland, separated from Europe as a distinct island, contradicted contemporary geography. In the 1400s, maps generally showed it as connected to northern Europe or Asia. The drawing style mimicked medieval cartography, but with subtle inconsistencies that suggested imitation rather than origin. Yet the allure of possibility persisted. Could it be that some long-lost Norse or Icelandic chart had survived in a monastic library, copied by a scholar of the early Renaissance? Could knowledge of Vinland, preserved in sagas and travelers' tales, have filtered into European cartography? The thought was intoxicating, a rewriting of discovery itself. Still, science waits for certainty. When the first chemical tests were applied to the map's ink in the 1970s, the results hinted at something extraordinary and troubling. But those results, and the debates they ignited, would unfold over decades. In this first act, the stage is set. A world where myth and manuscript meet, where the line between faith and forgery is drawn in fading ink. The parchment remains, silent and still, in the controlled air of an archive. But the question it poses echoes across time. How much of history do we see through the eyes of truth? And how much through the haze of our longing to believe? In the quiet laboratories of Yale University, under the hum of fluorescent light, the world's most mysterious map rested between glass sheets, fragile, yellowed, and trembling at the edges of history. Scientists and historians approached it as monks once approached relics, with reverence and doubt intertwined. Every fiber of its parchment, every curve of ink, seemed to hold the weight of an ancient truth, waiting to be confirmed or undone. The story of the Vinland Map had captivated scholars, and the public alike since its unveiling in 1965, newspapers hailed it as proof that Europeans had known of America long before Columbus. Museums and universities prepared to rewrite the story of exploration. But history, like the sea, has hidden currents, and truth is not always found on the surface. The first questions came not from skeptics, but from scientists, chemists, paleographers, and conservators who sought to understand the material itself. The parchment, as carbon dating later confirmed, was indeed medieval, crafted sometime in the mid-15th century. Its age aligned with the date suggested by its Latin script. But the ink, the very lifeblood of the drawing, began to tell a different story. When researchers at Yale and later the British Museum analyzed the ink under a microscope, they found traces of titanium dioxide, a compound that did not exist in medieval times. Specifically, they identified a crystalline form known as anatase, used in modern pigments since the 1920s. No medieval ink, made of iron gall or lampblack, had ever shown such a chemical fingerprint. The discovery sent a tremor through the academic world. If the ink was modern, then the map could not be genuine, no matter how old the parchment. The investigation deepened. In the 1970s and 1980s, scientists using electron microscopy and X-ray spectroscopy confirmed the presence of anatase across the map's lines. Each test pointed to the same conclusion. The ink was modern. Yet the forgery, if that was what it was, had been executed with extraordinary care. The lines were faint, as if aged deliberately, and the text mirrored medieval forms with remarkable precision. Whoever made it understood both history and deception. Debate raged in journals and conferences. Yale stood by the map's authenticity longer than most, arguing that the presence of anatase might be due to contamination, perhaps from later handling or conservation materials. Others countered that the anatase was embedded within the ink itself, impossible to have been added later. As the arguments multiplied, so did the questions of motive and origin. If forged, who had done it, and why? The provenance of the Vinland Map was as murky as the North Atlantic fog. It had appeared in the hands of a Swiss dealer named Enzo Ferrajoli de Rie, who claimed to have acquired it from an unknown European source shortly after World War II. From him, it passed to the American collector Lawrence Whitten, and from Whitten to Yale. There were no records before that, no mention in older inventories or scholarly references. The two companion texts bound with it, the Tartar Relation and Speculum Historiale, were genuine medieval works, but the map's presence among them seemed contrived, as though inserted to borrow their authenticity. In the shadowed corners of rare book markets, rumors began to circulate. Some speculated that the map was forged in the early 20th century, perhaps by a forger seeking profit or prestige. Others believed it might have been part of wartime intrigue, a fabricated document designed to stir national pride during an era when discoveries and origins were fiercely contested. But these remained conjectures, never proven, never admitted. The map itself refused to yield its maker's name. Meanwhile, the world of cartography and exploration history reeled. If false, the Vinland Map was not merely a forgery. It was a ghost that had haunted the idea of discovery itself. It had reignited centuries-old questions about who reached the Americas first, forcing historians to revisit evidence from the Viking Age, the sagas, and the archaeology of the North Atlantic. Long before the map surfaced, scholars had debated the saga's reliability. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red told overlapping but distinct stories. Voyages led by Leif Erikson, by his brother Thorvald, by Thorfinn Karlsefni, and even by Leif's sister Freydis, each venturing to lands west of Greenland. They described encounters with indigenous peoples, fierce battles, and landscapes filled with wild grapes, salmon, and forests, details that matched coastal regions of Atlantic Canada and New England. Archaeological finds at Lance aux Meadows, discovered by Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad in 1960, finally gave substance to these accounts. The settlement's design, its ironworking remains, and its radiocarbon dates proved that Norse explorers had indeed reached North America centuries before Columbus. That truth stood independent of any map. Yet the Vinland Map, had it been genuine, would have bridged the gap between the Viking world and the Europe of the Renaissance. Proof that the knowledge of Vinland had not been lost, but transmitted, copied, and preserved through medieval scholarship. That was the dream the map offered, and perhaps the reason so many wanted to believe it. But science and belief often sail in opposite directions. Through the 1980s and 1990s, each new test seemed to erode the map's credibility. Chemist Walter Macrone, a pioneer in microanalysis, examined samples under polarized light microscopy and confirmed the presence of synthetic anatase, consistent with modern industrial pigments. His findings were dismissed by some as overconfident, but later studies, including those by the Smithsonian and the University of Arizona, corroborated them. The case was growing undeniable. Still, the mystery lingered in the details. If the map was drawn on genuine 15th century parchment, how had the forger obtained it? The parchment's wormholes matched those in the companion texts, meaning it had been part of the same volume centuries earlier. Some theorized that the forger had found a blank sheet from that manuscript and used it to create the illusion of age. Others suspected that the map had been chemically treated to appear older than it was. Every explanation seemed to raise more questions. By the early 2000s, advanced testing provided the final blows to the map's credibility. Using high-resolution spectroscopy, researchers determined that the map's ink contained not only anatase, but also modern organic compounds consistent with 20th century writing materials. In 2021, Yale University itself released a comprehensive study concluding that the map was indeed a modern forgery. The titanium signature was ubiquitous and integral. Not contamination, not coincidence. After decades of debate, the verdict was clear. And yet, even in its exposure, the map retained its strange power. For nearly half a century, it had inspired countless discussions about the nature of discovery, authenticity, and the way history is written. It had drawn attention to the genuine achievements of the Norse explorers, whose voyages had reshaped the edges of the known world 1,000 years earlier. In its falseness, it had paradoxically illuminated the truth. In the broader arc of history, the Vinland Map became a symbol, not of deceit alone, but of our enduring desire to connect the fragments of the past. It revealed how easily myth and evidence can blur, how even the most rigorous minds can be swayed by the romance of discovery. It also underscored a deeper truth, that history is not static, but a living dialogue between evidence and imagination. The real story of Norse exploration remains far grander than any forged map. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Viking ships sailed farther than any Europeans before them. From Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to the shores of North America. They navigated by stars and sunstones, reading the color of the sea, the flight of birds, the scent of drifting wood. Their world stretched across the Atlantic like a chain of stepping stones, each island a link in humanity's expanding geography. In Greenland, their settlements clung to the edge of survival. The Norse farmers raised sheep and cattle on the thin soil of fjord valleys, traded walrus ivory and furs with Europe, and watched the climate grow colder with each passing century. When the Vinland voyages ceased, they remained, isolated, enduring, until the encroaching ice and silence consumed them. By the 15th century, the Greenland colonies had vanished, leaving only ruins and bones to mark their place in the northern wind. The sagas preserved their memory, oral histories passed down for generations, blending fact and legend, but never entirely lost. When the map appeared in the 20th century, it touched that same memory. For a moment, It seemed to give tangible form to the whispers of the sagas, to turn story into proof. That longing to believe, to see myth made material, is what made the Vinland Map so irresistible. But in the end, the story of the map is not one of discovery. It is one of reflection. It teaches us that history's power lies not only in what is true, but in what we choose to believe about truth. The parchment, the ink, the debates, all are part of humanity's endless quest to chart the unknown, to anchor legend in the geography of the real. Even in deception, the map drew our gaze westward, toward those cold shores where Leif Erikson and his crew once stepped ashore, lighting fires against the wind, unaware that their brief presence would echo across a millennium. It reminded us that discovery is never final. It is a mirror we hold to our own curiosity, our hunger to understand where we come from, and how far we've dared to go. In the stillness of modern archives, the Vinland Map now lies encased in glass, not as evidence of discovery, but as testimony to the fragility of truth. Its faint lines, drawn by an unknown hand, have traveled further through controversy than any ship ever sailed. Yet its journey, though born of deception, mirrors something profoundly human: the restless need to find where knowledge ends and imagination begins. When the story of its forgery was finally settled, the world did not turn away in disappointment. Rather, it turned inward. The map had not rewritten the past, but it had illuminated how the past is written, through fragments, through faith, through the persistence of those who search. The mystery it embodied forced historians and scientists alike to look more closely, to listen more carefully to what genuine evidence could reveal about the real Norse voyages that shaped the first European footprint on North American soil. Far to the north, where fog still wraps the Newfoundland coast, that evidence endures in the ground itself. The sod-walled dwellings at Lanso Meadows remain one of archaeology's purest truths. There, beneath layers of turf and time, the impressions of Norse longhouses form the silent outline of a moment when two worlds met. Iron nails, spindle whorls, and the broken remains of a bronze cloak pin speak of ordinary life, of ship repair, weaving, and trade. Radiocarbon and dendrochronology confirm their age around the turn of the 11th century. Nothing speculative, nothing imagined, only the tangible residue of real people who crossed the Atlantic before any map claimed they could. The site tells a story more powerful than any forged parchment could. It shows that discovery is not an event, but a continuum, a series of tentative steps, each built upon the courage to leave known shores. The Norse reached the edge of a continent and glimpsed its vastness, but they did not conquer it. They touched it and turned back. In that humility lies a certain grandeur. They were not empire builders or colonizers here, only explorers who carried with them the pulse of curiosity that defines humanity itself. As researchers expanded their work across the North Atlantic, new layers of this Viking world emerged, from the settlements of Greenland to outposts in the Canadian Arctic. Remnants of iron smelting, boat rivets, and trade goods painted a picture of far-flung connections. Isotopic analyses of artifacts suggested contact between Norse Greenlanders and indigenous peoples, possibly the Dorset or Thule cultures of Arctic Canada. DNA from ancient cattle bones hinted that livestock once crossed the same sea lanes. Each discovery extended the known boundaries of Viking movement, confirming that their world map, though unwritten, was wider than once imagined. The Norse were navigators of instinct and observation. They sailed without compasses, guided by the sun at noon, by coastal silhouettes, by the memory of waves. Icelandic sagas tell of men holding sunstones, crystals that polarized light, allowing sailors to locate the hidden sun on cloudy days. Recent experiments with Iceland spar have shown this method works. Physics has vindicated legend. Even without written charts, these sailors read the ocean like scripture, decoding its signs through generations of practice. For them, the Atlantic was not a void, but a vast road woven of winds and currents. And so, as the Vinland Map faded into infamy, the real map of Norse exploration grew clearer. Archaeology, not forgery, had traced the lines of truth. From Norway's fjords to Greenland's icy pastures, from Greenland to the coasts of Labrador and Newfoundland. These journeys formed the first bridge between Eurasia and the Americas, 1,000 years before the modern age of discovery. Their legacy lives not in ink, but in soil and stone, in ship timbers buried in peat, and in the enduring sagas that refused to die. The irony is profound. The false map once promised to prove what had already been proven by earth and evidence. Yet its deception renewed public fascination with the Vikings and sparked new research that expanded genuine knowledge. In unmasking the forgery, scholars uncovered more of the truth. History, as always, moved forward by confronting its own illusions. Today, in museums and universities, the Vinland Map is studied not as a chart of continents, but as a case study in human belief. It reminds curators and historians that authenticity is a moving horizon, that every generation must retest its assumptions, re-examine the artifacts it inherits. The same scientific methods that unmask the map now illuminate other enigmas: isotopic dating of parchment, spectroscopy of pigments, DNA sequencing of relics. Each technique sharpens our ability to distinguish myth from matter, yet none erases the allure of discovery. The human imagination, after all, is as old as the need to explore. If we look beyond the ink, we find a deeper continuity between the medieval world that dreamed of Vinland and the modern one that tried to draw it. Both were driven by the same question: what lies beyond the edge? For the Norse, that question was answered by the glint of an unknown coastline. For 20th century scholars, by the possibility that history itself might conceal uncharted knowledge. The impulse is identical: the refusal to accept that the map is ever complete. To understand the true legacy of Vinland, one must return to the human stories that underlie it. Imagine the Greenland settlers watching the western horizon from their turf-roofed farms. Men and women born of cold oceans and endless daylight, raising children amid ice and wind. Their lives depended on trade with Europe, on fragile ships crossing treacherous seas. Yet still they looked west. When they launched their voyages, they carried not only goods and tools, but an inheritance of myth. The certainty that there would always be another shore. That belief pushed them outward, and, in time, carried all of humanity across the globe. The first Europeans to stand on North American ground left no monuments, no written records, only the faint traces of their presence. But those traces are enough. They tell us that curiosity itself is ancient, that long before compasses and globes, people had already begun to knit the world together with courage and oars. Centuries later, when Columbus sailed from Spain, he followed different stars but the same instinct. His voyage was the echo of earlier footsteps, though he never knew it. The myth of discovery has always belonged to those who write the history. Yet beneath that narrative lies a deeper truth: that exploration is a shared inheritance, a chain of daring moments reaching back through countless unnamed voyagers. The Vikings were one link, others would follow. In the 21st century, the question, did the Vikings discover America first, is less a competition of pride than a meditation on connection. The Norse did reach America first, but discovery is not possession. The lands they touched were already home to thriving cultures, the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, and Inuit peoples, who knew the coasts and currents long before any northern sail appeared on their horizon. Their maps were not drawn on parchment but lived in memory and story, encoded in generations of observation. In that sense, all maps are dialogues between peoples, not declarations of ownership. Modern research increasingly honors this complexity. Archaeologists collaborate with indigenous communities to understand the Norse presence through shared knowledge. Oral traditions, once dismissed, now guide excavations and interpretations. The story of Vinland thus becomes not one of firsts, but of meetings, brief, cautious, perhaps tense, but nonetheless part of the broader human story of contact and exchange. The Vinland Map, though false, can still serve as metaphor. Its fading lines symbolize the fragile boundary between what we wish to be true and what we can prove. Its forgery reminds us that history is not a treasure to be possessed, but a truth to be earned. Every age redraws the map of its understanding, correcting errors, filling voids, erasing myths. In doing so, we navigate not the seas, but the labyrinth of our own memory. And beyond that reflection lies the simple, enduring wonder that once drove long ships westward into mist. The hunger to know what waits beyond sight. That impulse still defines us. It sends spacecraft into interstellar darkness, as once it sent sails into unknown waters. The map may be false, but the question it carried remains eternal. In museums where the parchment rests under controlled light, visitors still lean close to its surface, studying the lines that nearly deceived the world. Some feel disappointment, others fascination. But if they listen beyond the silence of glass, they might sense something older than ink. The rhythm of oars, the hiss of surf against a northern shore, the heartbeat of discovery itself. History, after all, is not only written, it is remembered through imagination. And imagination, though fallible, is the first compass humanity ever held. The Vinland Map's story ends where all journeys end, in understanding. It teaches that truth is not diminished by exposure, and that even a false map can lead to real horizons if it compels us to seek them. The Vikings' voyages remain the factual cornerstone, the map merely their echo. Together they reveal a profound symmetry. That human progress is born not from certainty, but from the courage to question it. So the question endures, not who discovered America first, but how far are we willing to go in search of truth? Every map ever drawn, every voyage ever sailed, answers that in its own way. The Vinland Map, in its paradox, reminds us that discovery is not about being first. It is about being curious enough to begin. The winds that once carried Norse ships westward still roam the Atlantic, moving across the ruins of Greenland's fjords and over the cold capes of Newfoundland. They whisper through the grass that grows where longhouses once stood, through the forests where new explorers walk. The same wind touches the parchment locked in its modern vault, stirring nothing, yet echoing everything. And in that wind, in the meeting of truth and myth, ink and ocean, time and tide, the story of the Vinland Map finds its final place. Not as forgery, not as revelation, but as a mirror held to the endless horizon of human wonder.